Hello everyone. I would love to have had the opportunity to be with you today live. Since I couldn't, at least I hope I will be able to answer some of the questions that you have and help you take the best possible decisions going forward. What I plan to do is basically to give you an overview of where Brazil currently stands, what I expect to happen in the near future, in the long term, and to be quite frank, those are quite different things. Brazil has gone through, and it is still going through, the hardest economic crisis it has ever had in its history. And if one looks to the prospects for the coming months, for the coming quarters, for maybe the coming year and a half, it's hard to be very bullish. Having said that, I do believe that medium and long-term perspectives for Brazilian economy, and particularly for infrastructure in Brazil and everything that is related to infrastructure, is extremely bullish. To be very frank, the way that I look at economics is that I believe, and that's what I have seen, basically studying 180 different countries and what has happened to them in the last 115 years, is that economics is extremely cyclical. What it means is that usually we tend to get more bearish exactly after very long and sharp economic contractions that tend to be close to the end. And I believe that's about the truth of the current situation in Brazil. Having said that, let me just start with where Brazil stands within Latin America and within South America. Brazil is roughly one-third, actually a little bit, Brazilian economy is a little bit more than one-third of Latin America. We can divide Latin America in three. One-third of it is Brazil, one-third of it actually is slightly less than one-third, that's the smallest slice, is Mexico and Central America, and then the rest of South America is one-third of it. So Brazil is roughly the size of the rest of South America, and it doesn't really matter what is the benchmark that you use to gauge this. It's in terms of area, population, direct investment, number of internet users, or mobile phones. All those numbers are for 2015. Having said that, when we look to how the Brazilian economy has behaved in the last 30 years, some things really call our attention. The first thing is, if we look to the 80s and until the first half of the 90s, in not only Latin America, not only Brazil, but in Latin America in general, this time is called the lost decade. And it's called the lost decade for a reason. If we compare the growth in the world and in emerging markets, developed markets, they were all growing slightly above 3% per annum. And then when we look to Brazil and Latin America, they were both growing more or less 1 percentage point less than the rest of the world every single year. And that's the reason why we call this the lost decade. What changes is specifically, not only in Latin America, but more in Brazil, in the following period. This period from 1995 through 2002 was when President Cardoso was in power in Brazil from a party called PSDB. And what happened was that at that point, hyperinflation, which was a huge problem in Brazil and Latin America in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s, was something that Brazil was able to tackle. And not only Brazil, most of Latin America tackled. But growth didn't speed up. If we look at growth, it was about the same. And the interesting thing was that growth in emerging markets was beginning to speed up. It's important also to have in mind that in the 80s and first half of the 90s, emerging markets were not really emerging. They were growing just as much as developed markets. So there was no emergence in emerging markets until the second half of the 90s. But when things really changed was in the beginning of the next cycle. In Brazil, it was 2002-2010 was when Lula da Silva was in office. But the big change didn't happen in Brazil. It was a global change. What happened was that in December 2001, China joined the WTO, and when that happened, there was a huge increase in the growth of not only China, but everything that was impacted by China. Because China basically impacted the world in many different forms. First, everything there is manufactured manufactured production started shifting to China in a speed that we never saw in the whole history of the world previously. But second, there was a huge increase in the demand for raw materials. And many emerging markets, and particularly Brazil and Latin America, are exporters of raw materials. As far as Brazil is concerned, we export agricultural products, but we also export metals, mining, and heavy oil. The bottom line was that there was a big increase after that in growth in emerging markets, but also in Brazil, Latin America. And meanwhile, what happened was that growth in developed markets was less than what it used to be. In general terms, emerging markets basically started to grow twice as fast than it did in the 80s, and developed markets started growing half as much as they used to. Why? Because China, for the most part, represented competition for developed markets, and for the most part, this is a big generalization, but for the most part, it represented an increasing demand for products where developing markets, emerging markets, were very competitive. So, and Brazil was able to take advantage of that in that period. What changes, and that's really the period that I'm going to focus more so that we can look forward, is the following 6 years, which in Brazil is basically the period when Dilma da Silva used to be the president, which was until a year ago when she was impeached. What you can see is that there was some slowdown in growth in developing markets and emerging markets, but and also in Latin America, but Brazil was totally out of sync with the rest of Latin America. In any other period, Brazil was growing about the same as the other countries in Latin America, not in the Dilma da Silva period. In that period, there was something very particular that went wrong in Brazil. Let me be more specific than that. If we get the last 15 years, every single year, most of the global growth didn't come from developed markets, but from developing markets. To be more specific, in average, of each $4 that the global economy increased in the last 15 years, 3 came out of emerging markets. And the interesting thing is that there was a big thing about emerging markets a couple of years ago, but in the last year, since China started to slow down, there was a big crisis in Russia, a crisis in Brazil. What we see in the headlines, in global newspapers, in television, is that the emerging market cycle is behind us. That's not what we see in data. When we look at data, we see that last year and in the previous year, the story was basically the same for emerging markets in general, but not for Brazil. In Brazil, things went wrong, and really wrong. What I get is that now I'm comparing Brazil's growth with every single country in the Americas during the Dilma da Silva, when Dilma Rousseff was in office. And what we see is that only Venezuela was able to have a worse performance, economic performance, than Brazil did. And that shows how Brazil is specific the problems were. And being quite frank, I think that from today's perspective, that's good news. That's good news because if, as the Workers' Party, the PT, used to claim that the problems in Brazil were caused by a global crisis that impacted Brazil, which is definitely not true. But if it were true, it would not be on Brazil's hand to change the current situation. Because it is Brazil specific, it is totally in Brazil's hand, and I think that's a positive. But I'll get to that later. Let me be more specific on how bad things went when Dilma Rousseff was in office. And by the way, when we thought that things would get better, there was a change 1 year ago after the impeachment. President Temer took office, but now is involved in a huge political and corruption scandal, and nobody really knows if he's going to be able to get to the end of his terms, and I'm going to get back to that. But the important thing is when I say that the bad economic performance was specific to the Dilma Rousseff period, let me show that in numbers. What you're going to see in white are the forecasts in December 31st by an average of over 100 economists, what they expected in December to happen in the following year. What you're going to see in green is what actually happened. And since Dilma Rousseff was in office for 5 years, I decided to take the previous 5 years from the previous administration, which, by the way, was from the same political party, the PT, from Lula da Silva. When Lula was in office, there was one exception and two trends. And I'm going to start with the exception. The exception was 2009. When there was the global financial crisis, Brazil was negatively impacted, as basically everybody. Initially, expectations deteriorated, but not that much. Reality was much worse than what we thought. We had a recession, but it was a recession that didn't last long. Quite the opposite. We had very fast growth in the following year. So basically, if I leave the year that Brazil was impacted by a global crisis, what we have are two trends. The first one is, every single year, the expectations for the following year were moving up. And second, they were moving up because every single year, what actually happened was better than what we expected to happen. So expectation was at this level, but because Brazil grew more than what we thought, economists raised expectation for the following year. Since it grew more, once again, they raised again. And once again, they raised again. And then there was that famous The Economist cover when the Christ was basically a rocket rising fast, which didn't come out to happen. And the reason why basically has to do with what happened when Dilma Rousseff was in office following that. Since she took office, basically we only had two trends in the whole period. The first one is every single year expectations were moving lower. And the second one is, despite lower expectations, every single year Brazil's economy disappointed. Every single year it grew less than expectations. One exception, 2016. 2016, a miracle happened. Economists' forecasts and what actually happened was exactly the same thing. That's very rare to happen. And the reason, again, was random. The reason is that Dilma Rousseff was in office for the first half of the year and things were deteriorating more than what economists expected. In the second half, she wasn't. And when the president changed, the economy started doing better. In average, it turned out to be exactly what economists expected. But the key point is the cycles, as I mentioned. In the positive part of the cycle, what we have is expectations moving up and still the economy doing better than the expectations that people had. Until it ends, as I said, it started moving up. Until in the negative part of the cycle, it's exactly the opposite. The economy disappoints, we lower expectations, it disappoints again, we lower, it disappoints again, it lower, and the key point is this cycle also ends. And we have an opposite one, which already started in Brazil. The key point is, no, expectations for the Brazilian economy this year, next year, are not great at all. Absolutely not. But they are clearly much better. We can see that they are not going down, they're going up. And when they start to go up, and that's not Brazil specific, that basically happens everywhere. But as far as Brazil is concerned, what happens is the economy starts doing better than what people expected. And it has already started. In the first quarter of this year, GDP growth was 1%, which, as compared to the previous quarter in seasonally adjusted terms, which, as measured as the US does, which annualizes the number, it means growth of 4.1% in the first half of this year. Basically, that would be Brazil's growth if the same speed, the same rhythm of growth of the first quarter were maintained for the whole year. The key point is, there is no one at all in Brazil that expects Brazilian economy to grow at 4% or even more than that this year. Actually, expectation is for GDP growth of 0.4% this year. So my key point is, if it were not for a big new political shock, which are the neo-corruption scandal involving the president that came out 2 months ago, basically we would almost certainly have much faster growth than what people were expecting. The key point is, at this point, lots of uncertainty might actually bring growth lower than what it would have been otherwise. When companies don't really know what's going to happen in the future, they tend to be much more conservative in their investment decisions, which means less jobs being generated, and with less jobs, there is less consumption. As companies sell less, they tend to hire less, and we have the negative cycle that I mentioned, which was basically what made Brazil's economy during the Dilma Rousseff period disappoint every single year. So the point that I'm trying to make is Brazil has entered a new cycle where the economy is poised to do better than what people expect and grow more in the coming years, every single year more than in the previous ones for a couple of years. How long do those cycles last? It really depends. In the last 115 years in the 180 countries that I measured, what I saw is that the shortest economic cycles, when surprises tend to be either positive or negative, last for 3 years. But they may last much more. They may last 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years in the same direction. It really depends on how good is the job that the government does. And the key point is, at this point, it's very hard to say because no one really knows what happens at the presidential elections in 2018. I'm going to get back to that point later, but it's hard to see how the economy is going to do if we don't know who's going to be in office, what kind of policies they're going to support. But I'm going to get back to that later. For now, I want to show why and how the economy started to do worse and later better. Basically, it was moved by confidence. And when confidence is going up, there is more investment, there is more consumption, and there is more growth. When confidence is going down, there is exactly the opposite. Dilma Rousseff took office here, when confidence in Brazil was at its highest. But then, following several economic policies that didn't really make sense, confidence started moving down, until in December 2015, we see a small spike, which was the beginning of a change of a cycle, which was a negative cycle in confidence, turned into a positive one. The reason is that in December 2015, Dilma Rousseff's impeachment process started to move. And as it happened, confidence started to move up. The key question is, at this point, it moved up because the policies which current president Michel Temer supports are pro-market. He basically started with some reforms to tackle some of the big macroeconomic problems that Brazil had. The first one, which is there is a huge deficit in the fiscal accounts. So what he did was, the first measure that he was able to approve is one that puts a cap on how much the government can spend. The problem is, to make sure that this cap can be sustained in the long term, in a way that doesn't mean less investment in infrastructure, in healthcare, in education, there is only one way. Brazil needs to do a big social security reform. And it was likely that would occur until 2 months ago, when we have this big JBS scandal, which is the meat company, which basically, according to information that we currently have, they had bribed almost 2,000 politicians in Brazil. What happened at this point is that Congress basically doesn't vote anything anymore. So all the reforms that were moving forward, I mentioned the public security reform, but on top of it, there is a big labor reform, which at this point might still be approved, but not the original bill. There are some key points where the government is likely to change. One of it is that Brazil currently has a law where everybody, it doesn't matter if they want or not, they need to fund, every worker funds the unions. So that brings a lot of cash to unions, that many labor unions, that many times don't really fight for workers, but basically fight to create difficulties to business owners in a way that they can solve solutions, they can sell solutions, which by sell I mean they are basically looking for ways to get bribed. So you have plenty of corruption in labor unions in Brazil as well. One of the things that the reform did was that it made contributions to the unions optional. So every single worker would have the right to choose if they want. So if they think that the unions are really helping them, they would basically fund the unions. Otherwise, they would not. In most cases, Brazilians don't think that the unions are helping them. So that would bring a big change, not only to the labor relations, but also to the politics in Brazil, because labor unions play a big role in politics in Brazil. But having said that, when confidence started to move up, Brazil's economic prospects started to improve. So, as I said, what we started to have is that expectations for growth, those come from the same survey done by the central bank with over 100 economists, it started to move up. Until about 2 months ago, following again the corruption scandals, they started to move down. And this is really the part that that worries me, in the sense that it was clear, and it is still is to me, that Brazil is about to be, it had already started the positive cycle. My concern is that this shock, this political shock, might postpone the recovery of growth, and certainly as well the recovery in infrastructure investment. Having said that, one thing that I don't see the government doing, but I do believe that they should, is basically at this point, they need to create a positive shock to the economy. And one easy way to do that would be if they speeded up the process of concessions, particularly in roads, airports, because basically investment in sectors that are very labor intensive, that have a strong economic multiplier. In other words, you hire many people that didn't have a job, didn't have income. When they do, they start spending. That has a positive impact in the economy. That should be one of the things that the government should be looking at. But at this point, the government seems to be focused in one single issue, which is to avoid all the pitfalls that could potentially make the current president, Temer, not be able to end its term. Again, I'm going to talk about that with more details later. But talking about jobs, again, Dilma Rousseff takes office here, and then job creations started slowing down. It turns negative in 2015 until when the impeachment process of Dilma Rousseff started to move, the reduction in job offers started decreasing until this year, it actually turns positive. Brazil has resumed creating more jobs. That's important because one of the things that happened in this whole economic and political crisis was that Brazil lost its investment grade rating. And the key thing is, after that, the cost of capital in Brazil has increased a lot, but the attraction of investment hasn't been impacted as much as many feared. To be more specific, in the first 5 months of this year, Brazil has had the largest volume of foreign direct investment in the country in its history. What is, to me, more concerning is in the average monthly foreign direct investment in the first 4 months was $7.5 billion per month. In May, it was only 3 million. May, again, that's when the new political scandal came. So what really has had a negative impact in Brazil's attraction of foreign direct investment is not really the fact that Brazil has lost its investment grade rating, but more specific, the new political scandal potentially, the key question at this point is, will this increase investment in Brazil for the long term, or basically cause just a delay in some of the investment projects that were about to happen and people are waiting and seeing what's going to happen in the political front before actually making the investment? It's too early to tell, but that's one of the concerns that I have. Because basically, this is the investment that is generating the jobs that we're seeing. And then there is another thing that made me believe that the cycle had everything to turn more positive fast, and now makes me question that, which is basically the following. If we look to the real exchange rate in Brazil in the last 30 years, what we see is huge changes. So what we have here in the left is in current terms, the dollar-real exchange rate how much it would have been when we adjust for inflation in Brazil and all its trading partners. And the key point is, again, when the Brazilian economy is strong, it attracts more investment, it exports more, and then the supply of dollars and foreign currency in Brazil in general is larger, which means a stronger real, which is when we have a lower exchange rate. That's what happened through the period 2002, 2011. 2011, Dilma Rousseff takes office, Brazilian economy starts to deteriorate, and the cost of foreign currency in Brazil goes up a lot. Until again, December 2015, impeachment processes start to move and then it falls. And probably the real would continue to get stronger. The key point is, in the last months, we had exactly the opposite. Why? Once again, it is related to the new political scandals. Why that matters? Because remember that from 2011, when Dilma Rousseff takes office, until 2015, the dollar moves up and so does inflation in Brazil. As the dollar or the cost of foreign goods in Brazil becomes more expensive, inflation increases a lot. And then 2015, December 2015, the impeachment moves, confidence moves up, Brazil foreign direct investment attraction increases, Brazil's real becomes stronger, and then we have inflation collapsing. Why it matters? Because as inflation collapses, so does interest rates. And interest rates in Brazil is a whole new chapter, because while we have nominal basic rates in the world that vary from negative to 0, 1, 2% at most, in Brazil, until a couple of months ago, the basic interest rates used to be 15% per annum. It has fallen to 10, which is still huge. And my point is, with inflation lower than the inflation target and it's still falling, rates are going to fall as well. Why it matters? Because as it does, lots of infrastructure projects that are not financially feasible with rates of 12, 15% per annum, they become feasible when rates fall to 8 or 7. And that's one of the reasons why I do think that investment in infrastructure in Brazil going forward is going to increase, which basically has to do with the following. We have very low rates in the world and still very high rates and rates of return in infrastructure investment in Brazil. So my key concern as far as infrastructure investment in Brazil is not if there's going to be availability of funding, which I believe there will be plenty of. My key concern is if regulation for infrastructure investment in Brazil is going to be good enough so that companies feel safe enough to invest. And one of the key points is political stability. So political instability is what creates my biggest concern in terms of if we're going to have a big increase in investment in infrastructure, which I don't have any doubts that eventually we will. My question is how long it will take. My concern at this point is that in the upcoming year and a half, I do believe there is going to be some recovery, but I don't think it's going to be as fast as it could have been otherwise, if not for the new political scandals involving the president and so many other politicians. But the bottom line is lower rates means more credit means more investment. Particularly what we have is that the auto and construction sectors start doing much better. And that's exactly what I believe going forward. Let me talk a little bit about politics. This is Joesley da Silva, who is the... Joesley Batista. I don't know why I'm basically making everybody's last name da Silva today, but they're not. Joesley Batista, which basically is the guy who brought the new political scandal to Brazil. And basically, the other guys here, I asked you who is the leader from PSDB, Temer, the current president, Lula da Silva, Dilma, they are all involved in big political scandals. The key point is, the whole story is, Joesley has taped conversations with several politicians were bribed were involved, including all of them, including President Temer, who is in office. And so there is currently a lawsuit that has been brought by what we call the public ministry in Brazil, which basically wants to have Temer removed from office. The thing is, the process to have him removed from office is very hard to come, because basically first there is a justice commission in the Senate that needs to approve it. That's something that might happen in the coming week. If it doesn't, it's going to probably happen in August, because then the Congress is going to be in recess, is going to be on vacation for a month. But anyway, if approved, which is far from sure, then the whole lower house needs to vote on if they accept or not this lawsuit. It's unlikely to be accepted because 2/3 of the lower house will need to accept. If it happens, then it goes to the Supreme Court in Brazil that can basically judge on the lawsuit, or any one of the 10 judges of the Brazilian Supreme Court can basically say what here we call pedir vistas, which basically means they want more time to check the process, and it can take as long as they want. So that's a way to block the process. That's all to say that it's very unlikely that this whole thing is going to be able to remove Temer. But at the same time, meanwhile, new scandals are coming to the public attention almost on a weekly basis. And as that happens, his ability to move forward on a positive reform agenda has been strongly deteriorated. So at the same time, it's hard to take him from office, but in office, it's very hard to him to govern. And that's where we stand at this point. And the key point is how much this is going to impact an economy that was beginning to recover, but it was just beginning to. And it's early to say. Some people expect and believe and hope, and in my opinion, there is a lot of hope there. The economy is going to be able to dissociate from the political mess. I have a hard time believing in that, because basically, while it is true that the business community does want that to happen, every single business leader, when they are taking their own investment decisions, say, yes, I do hope that happens, but I'm not going to be the first one to make the investment while I don't know if this will actually turn true. So let's wait and see. But at this point, I think there are big doubts related to that. And let me be more specific in terms of the challenge that Brazil has going forward. The first one, which is more obvious, is, and that's the challenge and the opportunity. Brazil's infrastructure is terrible. I'm going to get to more details on that. But the problem is money to make the investment. The government at this point is running huge deficits. And at the same point, while the tax burden in Brazil is extremely high, if one compares the total tax burden of 156 emerging markets, only 3 of them have higher tax burden than Brazil. And those are only the countries where social security spend is extremely high, because the population is much older than in Brazil. I'm talking about Poland, Hungary, and I think it's Czech Republic, the third one. I'm not sure about it. But anyway, my point is, at the same point, Brazil needs to reduce taxes, it needs to do a tax reform, while it improves fiscal accounts. There is only one way to do that. Brazil needs to cut spending. And the big spending that needs to be cut is social security. And that's why the reform is so important. And at this point, it's hard to believe it's going to move. At the same time, Brazil really needs to tackle a big problem, which is red tape. Things that could take much less time take much more. Particularly in infrastructure projects, it's a huge problem, because not only projects that elsewhere can be done in much less time, because all the approvals necessary to do the works take much longer in Brazil than elsewhere, but given that interest rates in Brazil are higher, this really makes plenty of projects unfeasible. And so that's a key point to tackle, but at this point I don't really see any big effort in that. That's the kind of development rather than just short-term growth policy that Brazil should be focusing on. At this point, it's not happening. And meanwhile, one of the reasons why we have not only the problems in fiscal accounts, but big problems on in the perception that the population has regarding politicians is a huge political scandal. And that's the reason why what we call the car wash Lava Jato operation, which is basically fighting corruption at this point, because there are so many politicians involved just in Congress. One in each 3 senators is currently under investigation. In the lower house, the number is similar. So the bottom line is that politicians at this point are much more worried about finding a way to save face and in several cases not go to jail rather than to move a positive agenda forward. So far, the key message that I want to make is prepared. I don't think that the upcoming quarters are going to be easy. Potentially the upcoming year, I'm talking about 2018, is going to be hard as well. Better than the previous 2 years, but it's still very hard. Having said that, I do believe that medium to long-term prospects are positive. Why? Let me be more specific. First is how bad things are and the opportunity that we have. If we look to the world rankings by the World Bank, 148 countries, Brazil ranks among the worst in every single important part of infrastructure that we look at. And when I mentioned before that I don't have any doubts that there is interest in investments, as far as your business is concerned, there is a big opportunity and a big challenge. And we can see that in the recent bids that we had in the electricity sector. We have a big movement by Chinese companies basically investing heavily in infrastructure in Brazil. My view is that this is very likely to increase going forward. And the reason is that the connection between the Chinese economy and Brazil is huge, twofold. First, as everywhere, most of the consumption manufactured goods that Brazil currently consumes come from China, but that's true everywhere. What is not necessarily true everywhere is that Brazil has become one of the largest suppliers of several agribusiness products to China. Particularly, I'm talking about soybeans and everything that is related to soybeans, and not only, by the way, agribusiness, but also metals and mining, iron ore, steel. And the key point is that the lack of transportation infrastructure in Brazil has actually impacted the ability of those goods to come to China. So when China invests in Brazil's infrastructure, there are 3 big potential gains for China. The first one, obvious gain, is the rates of returns that they can get here, which for the most part they don't get elsewhere. But the second, which I think is as important as, in many cases, not only it happens its own Chinese suppliers. Remember that as far as Chinese investment is concerned, we are talking investment that is related to the Chinese government some way, is to bring Chinese suppliers here. And the third one is to make sure, when I'm talking about transportation infrastructure, that the goods that China needs actually get to China and get cheaper to China, because this lack of infrastructure in Brazil doesn't become so much of a problem as it currently is. This is long-term Brazilian growth history, and that explains why I'm positive medium to long-term. I want to show 2 things. This is average GDP growth every 3 years, and every single time that there was a sharp recession in Brazil, and by a sharp recession I mean when 3-year average growth turns negative or close to negative, we had 2 things happening in Brazil. The first one was political transition. And the second one was that following the political transition, growth speed up a lot again. Let me be more specific. In 1929, Brazil was growing at an average in the previous 3 years of 9% per annum. When there was the crash in the New York Stock Exchange and then the Great Recession going forward, what we have was the Great Depression going forward. what we had was that Brazil was impacted as well. At this point, there was, as it happened several times later on in Brazilian history, there was a political coup d'etat. We had a dictatorship from Getúlio Vargas that basically lasted until the economy collapsed again. When it did, actually, it was the end of the dictatorship. Democracy was back to Brazil and growth was back to Brazil. You can see that 3 years after the crisis, Brazil average growth was 7% per annum in those 3 years. Same here, 3 years after, average growth 7% per annum. And then we have democracy lasting in Brazil until, again, economic growth collapsed, and we had a military coup d'etat here in 1964. But again, following that, 3 years later, average GDP growth was 3% per annum. And the military dictatorship lasted until, again, a big collapse in growth. When it happened, democracy was back to Brazil, and 3 years later, average GDP growth was 7% per annum. And those democratic elected presidents, they all made through the end of their terms with 2 exceptions. When there was again negative growth in the beginning of the 90s, Collor da Silva was impeached. And again, 3 years later, GDP growth was 5% per annum in average in those 3 years. And more recently, Dilma da Silva was actually expelled from office. The point that I want to make is that in the last 115 years, the least that Brazil has grown, following a sharp economic contraction and the replacement in the person who was in office, was 5% per annum for at least 3 years. So either it lasted longer than that or growth was above that. And my key point is that at this point, there is no one expecting Brazil in the coming years to be able to grow at those speeds for several years. And I don't have any doubts that eventually this is going to happen. At this point, because of the current political crisis, I do have big doubts when this is going to start. My base case is it's probably not be fast, so we're going to have still hard times before this happens, maybe for a couple of months, a couple of quarters, or maybe a year and a half. But I do believe in the next economic cycle, things are going to turn for the better. And when they eventually do, that's when I think that the big opportunities are going to be here. Because usually, and those are what we call here in Brazil, paletas mexicanas, which basically is some kind of ice cream that was brought here and was a huge success. Many companies started following, many people started opening those ice cream parlor shops, and eventually there were so many of them that all of them, or most of them, went bankrupt. And I think that the same thing happened in the last years in several sectors in Brazil, unfortunately including the auto sector, including infrastructure sector. What I mean by that was there was a huge increase in supply, and then eventually demand collapses, and then those sectors went through very hard times. My point is, exactly after several years of hard times, we are probably closer to the point when this changes, and we're going to have a new cycle, which is going to last 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, I don't know how many years, which is going to be positive, and that's the time to take advantage of, which is basically the same story when the first guys were doing those paletas mexicanas. So I think that my key message here is hold on for the coming quarters, which are going to be probably the end of the hard times, so that you can be able to take advantage of the good times. How to do that? Make sure to keep costs as low as possible, but at the same time be ready when things start to speed up. And at the same time, what I do think that the whole industry needs to do is actually to put some more pressure in the government, actually to speed up investment in infrastructure. I think it is in the best interest of the country, it is in the best interest of the government, it is in the best interest of the companies in the sector. One more point. There's something that here in Brazil was called the new medium class, which is basically that from 2004, from 2015, 50 million Brazilians moved up to the upper and middle class. But the key point here is this hasn't ended. This is a process that is going on in the other emerging markets, and Brazil's process probably in the coming 10 years, when eventually the economy starts speeding up, something like 30 or 35 million people are going to be incorporated in the middle class or above, which means lots of consumptions, more growth, more need for infrastructure. The other key point is the importance of agribusiness. After China joins the WTO in December 2001, Brazil agribusiness trade surplus increases from 9 billion to 93 billion. It increases tenfold in 15 years. Why it matters? Not only because the agribusiness specific, which is huge, by the way, and how it happens basically is, if we compare Brazilian agribusiness exports in 2000 with 2015, it has increased about, it's twice as much for exports to developed markets, but it's 9 times larger for developing markets, which basically has changed the whole share of exports for Brazil. Why it matters? Because this has increased the need for infrastructure investment, particularly in transportation, particularly in the countryside, and that explains why, which basically a huge part of it is China, that's why Chinese investment is being attracted to Brazil. What has happened is the demand for agribusiness or agricultural products, the demand for foodstuff increases, is that production in Brazil has increased and Brazil's rankings in terms of both production and exports has improved a lot. If we look to orange juice is probably the most important case where over 60% of global production comes out of Brazil. But the same thing in terms of sugar, coffee, soybeans, poultry, corn, meat, and pig meat as well. So basically, until China joins the WTO, Brazil's total crop was about stable. After it joins, it has increased fourfold. If we get the revenues, the story is interesting because there is a huge increase in revenues, particularly in the last 5 years. And the reason is that we had a big devaluation, remembering that the currency, Brazilian currency, $1 was worth here in beginning of 2011, $1 was worth R$1.50. Here, it was worth R$4. So this increases a lot the revenues in reais for the Brazilian producer. Why it matters? Because that's one of the key advantages of agricultural production in Brazil as compared actually to the US, which is every single time, because Brazil is a huge exporter of several crops, what happens is several grains, particularly, is and animal protein as well. But what happens is when there is an increasing global demand, the prices tend to move up. At that point, Brazil's exports increase, and when it does, the supply of dollars in Brazil increase and the real gets stronger, which reduces the profitability of the Brazilian producer at good times. That's a negative. But the positive is at bad times, when the global market is weaker, exports of raw materials are lower. At the same time, prices of raw materials, in particular of agribusiness, of foodstuff, tend to move down. But at that point, as Brazilian exports are reduced and the supply of dollars in Brazil is also reduced, what happens is that the real gets weaker, and then as international prices are set in dollar terms, the revenues of the Brazilian exporters in reais terms move up when things are tough. So the key point is the agribusiness sector is very volatile. And volatility in Brazil, because of the change in the currency, which moves in the opposite side, the opposite direction of international prices, this reduces a lot volatility in terms of revenues for the Brazilian producer. And that helps a lot the competitiveness of the sector. So what do we see again? In terms of production, I just want to give one example. I could get any other crop, but getting soybeans. Prior to China, 10 years, growth of basically doubled production. After China, it increased again fourfold. After China joins the WTO. Same story in terms of corn, pre-China, basically stable, post-China, three times larger. Why I'm saying that? Because this will continue to grow. And as it continues to grow, the need for infrastructure and investment in infrastructure also continues to grow. The key point is that even if I don't count the Amazon region, let's take good care of the Amazon, still, the area that remains in Brazil that can be used for crops is the size of 33 different countries in Europe together. So basically, despite the fact that the area in Brazil, the territory, Brazilian territory, is not as big as US, Russia's, or China's, because Brazil doesn't have any kind of desertic area, the area that can be planted is larger than elsewhere, and the area that is currently planted is much smaller. So basically what it means is a lot of room for increase in production going forward, which also means a lot of room for more demand for investment in infrastructure. One of the key consequences of that is that because the agribusiness is growing fast, this pushes up growth in the countryside. In the last 15 years, every single year, no exception, the cities in the countryside of Brazil had higher average GDP growth than the capital of each of the 27 states that Brazil has. Why it matters? Because the infrastructure in the capitals is much better than the one in the countryside. The need for infrastructure increases more when the countryside is growing rather than the big cities. And that's one of the things that I think that this is going to bring good business opportunity going forward. And basically, that is happening currently. In the last 5 years, in the last 5 months of this year, among the 10 cities that generated more jobs in the country, 19 of them are cities in the countryside of Brazil. Just one, Goiás, is a capital of a state, and in any case, in the Midwest, which is basically a region that depends a lot in agribusiness. Why do I believe this is going to continue? Because this is being moved by the process of urbanization and increased manufacturing growth in China. As the Chinese move from the countryside, where it used to grow its own crops, it starts working in the manufacturing industry. In the coast, China needs to build its own infrastructure, and at the same time, it needs more food coming from abroad, and that's where Brazil stands. And in the last 10 years, 400 million Chinese moved from the countryside to the coastal area. According to the World Bank, 300 million more are going to move in the upcoming 10 years. As that happens, demand for raw materials and particularly for food is going to be strong. This is going to boost Brazil and Brazil's countryside. And eventually, as the Chinese cycle is over, the urbanization cycle is over, we're going to have a similar one coming from India. In the last 2 years, India has started to grow faster than China. Its population is as big as China's, but it's much poorer than China. And as poor people started doing better, the first thing that they do is that they eat more and they eat better. And as it happens, demand for Brazil's food stuff is going to increase, the need for infrastructure as well. Opportunity in construction. There is some problem with this slide. Anyway, let me try and show what I want to show here. The key point that I want to show is actually this should move across time. What we have in green is the income distribution in the US and in Europe. What we have in yellow is the income distribution in the rest of the world. When I say that there is some problems, that there should have been 3 points in time. The first one is 1980. And what we would have seen is this and this. So this. Most people in developing markets in the 80s had an income close to $1 or $2 per annum, which basically means that their consumption was close to nothing. It was very low. And as a consequence, the number of people in emerging markets with income above $50 per day in income was 1/9 than the one in Europe and in the US in 1980. In 2014, it was the first year when actually it was this curve. The number of people in emerging markets with income above $50 per annum was larger than in developed markets. But in terms of business decisions today, what we need is to look forward. And then when we do look forward, in 2035, so in 18 years, there's going to be, which is this income distribution here, we're going to have 9 times more people making more than $50 per day in emerging markets than in the US and Europe. Why I'm saying that? Because what basically that means is the increasing consumption and as a consequence of need of infrastructure and construction as a consequence in emerging markets, and particularly in the big emerging markets, is huge. And to me, that explains why, despite the fact that Brazil is going through its worst economic recession in history, worst political crisis in history, has lost its investment grade rating, how come foreign direct investment in the first 5 months was record high in Brazil? And the reason is that companies don't want to miss the opportunity of one of the few countries where you have two things in the long term. One is potential for fast growth. For the most part, developed markets are not growing as fast as they used to for demographic reasons, for several reasons, and they are not likely to in the upcoming decades. Emerging markets, for the most part, can grow fast, but most of them are small markets. In my opinion, there are 4 exceptions, which are China, India, Brazil, and Indonesia, which are markets that are at the same time big with big potential growth. We can discuss if Russia, Mexico, South Africa, Nigeria should be there, but those 4 that I mentioned in my view, they clearly have not only big markets, but potential big growth going forward. And that's why I was saying that I do believe that despite the fact the upcoming quarter is going to still be hard, I think that the long-term opportunity is big. Being a little bit more long-term view and a little bit more specific on why I think that the opportunity is big here in Brazil, I just got the last 2015 years here. The size of each circle is global per capita income. The height of it in the chart is the global population. At year 0, global population was only 200 million and per capita income was less than $500 per annum. 1850 years later, it hasn't changed much. It hasn't changed much because it only increases after we have an increase in production. And it only increases production after the first industrial revolution, but increases much faster following the second industrial revolution. Because then when electricity, cars, airplanes are introduced, we have a huge increase in income and in population, in consumption, in business opportunities. That is only small if we compare with the last 15 years. The key point that I want to make, and that I talk a lot to people in Brazil at this point, is it's very easy to get extremely bearish with what is going on in Brazil. There are all the reasons for it. Again, this has been the worst economic crisis in Brazilian history. Having said that, if we, instead of looking to the last 6 years, in particular the last 3 years, we look to long-term perspective, what we see is, first, in the world, there was never an age where so much wealth was being generated. Second, it's been out of those 5-fold increase that we had in the last 15 years in global per capita income, out of each $4 that were generated, 3 were generated in emerging markets. And most of it in the 4 big emerging markets. And that's basically why Brazil and the rest of emerging markets have been growing more in the last 15 years. But the key point is, when Brazil eventually solves the current political crisis, and eventually it will, I don't really have any doubts that it will speed up growth again. And that's why I do think that there is a big opportunity, particularly because when we look to investment in Brazil, if we look to investment ex construction, Brazil basically invests more than every single big country in the Americas with the exception of Mexico as a share of GDP. And it's actually slightly above global average. So Brazil does invest. Where it does not invest is in construction. It doesn't invest at all. It invests much less than it should. And that's why it's actually among the largest countries in the Americas, it's the one that invests the least. So my key point is there is only one way going forward if Brazil wants to become more competitive. Eventually, and I need to be frank that I don't see this in the agenda of any important politician at this point, but eventually someone needs to realize that if it wants to boost its development in the long term, there is only one way, and it requires more construction. And that's why, again, long term, I think that the prospects are positive, and that's really the last message that I want to make. Just one last point that I didn't cover yet, which is what might happen in the next election. And this is a big question mark. And I think that at the same point, which Brazil has elections, it's going to have elections in October 2018. And it's a big question mark, and the reason is, in my view, the only thing that to me is clear is that traditional politicians have a very, very, very slight chance of winning the election. That's a global process, but in Brazil it's stronger because the clash against traditional politicians is even stronger than elsewhere in a moment where corruption scandals basically are everywhere. But then, if something more positive or more negative, because that's when usually populists get elected, and that's a risk that Brazil is running. At the same time, there is a risk, a positive risk, that someone with a more positive agenda might eventually be elected. And I can get two examples of the two things happening, which basically happened in the last elections here in the cities in Brazil. We have elections in municipalities. We had in 2016. And if we get the election in the city of São Paulo, the largest city of Brazil, what we had was that someone, which is a business person, who was never in politics, easily won the election with a much more pro-business agenda. At the same time, in Rio, we had a second term election in the end, which basically the two guys that were running were a radical left-winger who lost, and someone who comes from basically the church, who basic political support comes from being a strong priest in the country, and with a very populist agenda as well. So the key question is how things evolve in the coming quarters and what shapes up for the election so that we can know the kind of policies. We might have the positive cycle that I mentioned really speeding up from 2019 onwards, but it really depends on the result of the elections, and I think it's too early to try to call some kind of results. And again, eventually, because of the lack of infrastructure, because of growth speeding up, the opportunity is going to be big. Short term, not so much. Thank you. It was a big pleasure.